It began with a sound, the deep, throaty growl of the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine carrying Spitfires and Mustangs into the skies of Europe. A sound that came to symbolize resistance, survival, and sheer human determination. Yet, before the war was over, another sound shattered the skies, the piercing scream of the jet engine. In less than a decade, aviation leapt from piston-driven dogfights to the dawn of supersonic flight. World War II was not just a clash of armies, it was a crucible of technology. In the desperate race for survival, nations pushed aviation forward, at a pace the world had never seen. What began as fragile propeller-driven machines became engines of innovation, laying the foundation for the jet age, commercial aviation, and even the space race. This is the story of how war's darkest hour ignited humanity's greatest leap into the skies. From the roar of the Merlin to the scream of the jet, witness how WWII sparked the age of flight. Long before the skies thundered with the Merlin's roar or the jet's scream, humanity's dreams of flight were fragile, almost naive. In the early 20th century, aviation was still in its infancy. The Wright brothers' breakthrough in 1903 had proven that powered flight was possible, but for decades afterward, aircraft were rudimentary, underpowered, and limited in range. Wooden frames, fabric skins, and simple piston engines defined the era. During the First World War, airplanes were primarily reconnaissance tools, later adapted into fighters and bombers. Yet despite their daring use, they remained unreliable and technologically constrained. Speeds rarely exceeded 120 miles per hour, altitudes were low, and endurance was measured in minutes rather than hours. Still, the war revealed one undeniable truth. Air superiority could shape the battlefield. Between the wars, engineers and nations invested cautiously in flight. In Britain, Rolls-Royce began refining powerful piston engines, culminating in prototypes that would eventually lead to the legendary Merlin. Germany, under restrictions from the Treaty of Versailles, still secretly advanced aviation technology, with engineers like Hugo Junkers pioneering all-metal aircraft designs. Meanwhile, visionaries such as Frank Whittle in Britain and Hans von Ohain in Germany quietly explored a radical concept, the jet engine. But in the 1920s and 1930s, jets were still a dream too far. Fuel efficiency, metallurgy, and aerodynamics simply hadn't caught up. Instead, nations poured resources into developing faster, more reliable piston-powered planes. The Schneider Trophy seaplane races became testbeds for innovation, pushing aircraft like the Supermarine racers to record-breaking speeds, technological lessons that would later feed directly into the design of the Spitfire. At the same time, aviation philosophy was shifting. No longer seen as fragile contraptions, aircraft were becoming central to national defense and prestige. Theories of strategic bombing, championed by thinkers like WWII, argued that wars could be won from the air. The groundwork was being laid intellectually and technically for aviation to become the decisive force in global conflict. Thus, by the late 1930s, the stage was set. The propeller-driven fighters and bombers were reaching their peak, but just beyond the horizon, the seeds of something revolutionary were already germinating. World War II would be the furnace in which these ideas would be tested and transformed forever. The Second World War was not only a clash of armies and ideologies, it was also the ultimate testing ground for aviation's next great leap. By the late 1930s, piston engines had pushed aircraft performance close to their limits. Fighters, like the British Spitfire, powered by the mighty Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, could climb high and fly fast, but there was a ceiling to what propellers and reciprocating engines could deliver. Engineers on both sides of the conflict knew: to go faster, higher, and deadlier, something radical was needed. That radical idea had already been whispered in laboratories. As early as the 1920s, the notion of using gas turbines to create continuous thrust had circulated among visionary engineers. In Britain, a young Royal Air Force officer named Frank Whittle filed a patent in 1930 for a turbojet engine. His design imagined compressing air, mixing it with fuel, igniting it, and channeling the explosive force directly backward to propel an aircraft forward. It was brilliant in theory, but at the time, industry leaders dismissed it as impractical, too complex, too expensive, and far ahead of available metallurgy. Across the Channel, in Germany, a parallel story unfolded. Hans von Ohain, a physicist, working independently, developed his own jet propulsion ideas. By 1936, he partnered with Ernst Heinkel, a daring aircraft manufacturer willing to gamble on untested concepts. While Whittle struggled to secure funding in Britain, von Ohain had the full backing of Heinkel's workshops. In 1939, the Heinkel He-178 took to the skies as the world's first turbojet-powered aircraft. It was a proof of concept more than a warplane, but it confirmed what visionaries had dreamed. The jet age was real. Britain, meanwhile, lagged behind, not because of lack of genius, but because of lack of belief. Whittle's early prototypes, developed under his company Powerjet's Lilitude, ran into financial and bureaucratic obstacles. Yet persistence paid off. By 1941, the Gloucester E-2839, powered by Whittle's W1 engine, made its first flight. It was Britain's answer to Heinkel's bold experiment, and a symbol that the Allies were no longer behind in this race. For both nations, these prototypes were more than machines. They represented a breakthrough in physics and engineering. Piston engines, with their thousands of moving parts, operated like mechanical hearts pumping in cycles. Jet engines, by contrast, were streamlined systems of compression, ignition, and thrust, delivering continuous power. Where propellers clawed at the air, jets sliced through it with sheer force. The future of flight had shifted overnight. Still, the path was anything but smooth. Metallurgy became the critical bottleneck. Early jet engines generated extreme heat far beyond what most alloys of the time could endure. Engineers in both Britain and Germany scrambled to find materials that could withstand the stress of continuous high-speed combustion. Failures were frequent, and many early engines burned out after only a handful of hours. Yet every test brought refinements, every setback brought innovation. The war accelerated everything. For Germany, desperate for technological advantages, the Luftwaffe pressed Heinkel and Messerschmitt to transform jet experiments into operational fighters. The result was the Messerschmitt Me 262, the world's first combat-ready jet aircraft. Its speed and firepower shocked Allied pilots, though delays in production and Hitler's insistence on using it as a bomber limited its strategic impact. Still, its very existence proved the dawn of a new era. On the Allied side, Britain advanced steadily with the Gloucester Meteor, powered by Whittle's engines. Though entering combat late in the war, it became the first Allied jet fighter to see service, intercepting German V-1 flying bombs with unmatched speed. Even in limited numbers, the Meteor demonstrated the practicality and promise of jet propulsion. In warfare, public reaction, when finally revealed, was awe. Pilots who experienced the first jets spoke of an entirely new sensation: the seamless thrust, the thunderous scream, the feeling of breaking free from the old constraints of flight. To the outside world, still used to the sight and sound of propellers, these machines seemed like science fiction come alive. In just a few short years, what began as scattered patents and isolated experiments had leapt into working prototypes and combat aircraft. The spark had ignited. The Merlin still roared in the skies of WWII, but the scream of the jet had already announced the next age of aviation. When the jet engine first roared to life in the late 1930s and early 1940s, it was still a fragile, temperamental technology, barely trusted by its own engineers. Yet within only a few decades, it would evolve into the beating heart of modern air power, civil aviation, and even space exploration. The journey from prototype to dominance is one of the most dramatic arcs in technological history, a story shaped by war, rivalry, and relentless ambition. World War II marked the first practical application of jet propulsion. In Germany, the Messerschmitt Me 262 became the world's first operational jet fighter. With top speeds exceeding 540 mph, it could outrun and outclimb anything the Allies put in the sky. Allied pilots who faced it described the experience as if a meteor had torn through the formation, attacking and vanishing before piston fighters could even react. Yet, the Me 262's brilliance was undercut by Germany's crumbling war machine. Engines failed after only a few flight hours, materials were scarce, and Hitler's insistence on converting it into a fighter bomber delayed its deployment. It arrived too late and in too few numbers to alter the war's outcome. Across the Channel, Britain fielded the Gloucester Meteor in 1944, initially tasked with intercepting V-1 flying bombs. Though slower and less advanced than the Me 262, the Meteor proved more reliable and provided the RAF with crucial early experience in jet operations. Meanwhile, in the United States, the Bell XP-59 Aerocomet flew in 1942, but it was underpowered and impractical, useful more as a learning platform than a combat machine. Still, America gained a foothold in the new propulsion frontier. By the war's end, jets had proven themselves possible, but they were far from perfect. Fragile engines, high fuel consumption, and maintenance issues held them back. Yet every major power now recognized the future belonged to jet propulsion. The post-war years saw a frenzy of jet development as nations scrambled to secure air superiority. Britain, leveraging Whittle's pioneering work, developed aircraft like the DU, Havilland Vampire and the Hawker Hunter. France pushed ahead with the Dassault Ouragan and Mystère series, while the Soviet Union, rapidly reverse-engineered, captured German designs to produce the MiG-9, and soon after, the legendary MiG-15. The MiG-15's debut over Korea in 1950 was a shock to the West. Fast, powerful, and heavily armed, it challenged the United States' best piston fighters with devastating results. America answered with the F-86 Sabre, and the skies above Korea became the first true jet-versus-jet battleground in history. Dogfights at transonic speeds tested the limits of both machines and pilots, ushering in a new age of aerial combat. Tactics. Meanwhile, jet bombers emerged as strategic tools in the nuclear era. Britain unveiled the V-bomber fleet. The US developed the B-47 Stratojet, and the Soviets countered with the Tu-16. Speed was no longer just a tactical advantage. It became a strategic imperative in a world shadowed by atomic weapons. By the 1960s, engineers were no longer satisfied with subsonic or even transonic performance. The quest for supersonic flight consumed the aerospace world. The US fielded the F-100 Super Sabre, F-104 Starfighter, and eventually the iconic F-4 Phantom II, aircraft that redefined air power with radar-guided missiles and speeds over Mach 2. The Soviets kept pace with the MiG-21 Fishbed, a lightweight, agile fighter that became one of the most widely produced jets in history. France introduced the Dassault Mirage III, excelling in both speed and climb rate, giving Europe its own supersonic pride. Jet bombers also pushed boundaries. The American B-58 Hustler became the world's first supersonic bomber, while the Soviet Union's Tu-22 Blinder entered service. Though expensive and often plagued with problems, these aircraft reflected the era's obsession with speed as the ultimate measure of power. Beyond the military, civilian aviation caught the jet fever. The Boeing 707, entering service in 1958, revolutionized commercial travel. For the first time, ordinary passengers could cross the Atlantic in hours instead of days. Jetliners shrank the world, binding continents together and transforming economics, politics, and culture. Air travel shifted from an elite luxury to a mass-market phenomenon. The 1970s were marked by both ambition and realism. Supersonic passenger travel became a reality with the Anglo-French Concorde and the Soviet Tu-144. Sleek and futuristic, they represented engineering triumphs, but high operating costs and the oil crisis limited their adoption. While they thrilled the imagination, it was subsonic wide-body jets, like the Boeing 747, that truly changed global mobility. Nicknamed the Queen of the Skies, the 747 made long-haul flights affordable for millions, democratizing international travel. In the military sphere, the Cold War arms race drove advances in agility, avionics, and weaponry. The US introduced the F-14 Tomcat, immortalized later in popular culture, and the F-15 Eagle, designed for air superiority dominance. The Soviets countered with the MiG-25 Foxbat, a blisteringly fast interceptor that terrified Western analysts. When a MiG-25 pilot defected to Japan in 1976, Western engineers marveled at its brute force design, realizing the Soviets had prioritized raw speed and altitude over finesse. The 1980s brought a profound shift. Instead of chasing raw speed, the US pioneered stealth technology. The F-117 Nighthawk, revealed to the world only after years of secrecy, demonstrated that radar invisibility could matter as much as velocity. This change represented a philosophical pivot. Air dominance was not just about flying faster, but about being seen less. Meanwhile, the F-A-18 Hornet and the Soviet Su-27 Flanker highlighted advances in maneuverability, avionics, and multi-role flexibility. Air combat was no longer about just speed or firepower. It was about systems integration, pilot training, and tactical doctrine. Civilian aviation expanded further with advanced airliners like the Airbus A310 and Boeing 757-767, increasing efficiency and safety. The skies became busier than ever, and jets were now an unquestioned part of everyday life. As the Cold War ended, attention shifted to precision, integration, and affordability. The Gulf War of 1991 showcased the effectiveness of modern jets, like the F-15, F-16, and Tornado, integrated with AWACS surveillance and precision-guided munitions. The world saw air power not just as blunt force, but as a scalpel. The 1990s and 2000s also brought the rise of fourth-generation jets with digital avionics, fly-by-wire systems, and advanced radar. The Eurofighter Typhoon, Dassault Rafale, and the Russian Su-30 exemplified this shift. Meanwhile, the US began work on the F-22 Raptor, the first operational fifth-generation fighter, combining stealth, supercruise, and integrated sensors in one platform. Civilian aviation continued its steady march with long-range giants like the Boeing 777 and Airbus A330. Globalization was now inseparable from jet-powered flight. Today, jets have reached a new plateau. Fifth-generation fighters, such as the F-35 Lightning II, the Russian Su-57 and China's J-20 represent the cutting edge of stealth, networking, and multi-role adaptability. These aircraft are not just machines, but nodes in a digital web of sensors and communication. Meanwhile, commercial aviation emphasizes fuel efficiency and sustainability, with composite-built aircraft like the Boeing 787 Dreamliner and Airbus A350. The focus has shifted from conquering speed to conquering efficiency and environmental challenges. The scream of the jet, once an exotic sound, is now the everyday hum above cities worldwide. From the roar of the Merlin engines in World War II to the whispering stealth jets of today, the evolution has been relentless, reshaping war, travel, and the very concept of distance. The ascent of jet aviation was not smooth. It was filled with dead ends, costly experiments, and tragic accidents. But step by step, decade by decade, the jet became not just a machine, but a symbol of speed, of power, of modernity itself. From the battlefields of World War II to the skies of the 1950s, the jet engine moved from experimental curiosity to the dominant force in global aviation. The revolution was swift, dramatic, and irreversible. The tipping point came not just from military necessity, but from a mix of economics, policy, and public imagination. By the early 1950s, nations realized that jets were no longer optional. They were essential. The Korean War underscored this brutally. Propeller-driven fighters like the P-51 Mustang were suddenly outclassed by the Soviet MiG-15, forcing the US to respond with the swept-wing F-86 Sabre. The dogfights over the Yalu River were not just tactical contests, they were demonstrations that the jet age had arrived, and there was no going back. Beyond combat, governments began pouring resources into civilian aviation. Britain's de Havilland Comet became the world's first commercial jetliner in 1952, shrinking continents and turning the globe into a smaller, faster connected world. Although early design flaws plagued the Comet, the idea of rapid, high-altitude passenger travel captured the public's imagination. Soon, Boeing, Douglas, and other American manufacturers refined the formula, ushering in the jet-powered golden age of air travel by the late 1950s. The shift was not only technological, but cultural. The sound of jet engines became a soundtrack of modern life, thundering over cities, airports, and television screens. For the military, jets meant faster response times, higher altitudes, and strategic dominance. For civilians, jets redefined business, diplomacy, and tourism. Suddenly, what once took days by ship or train could be achieved in hours. The psychological distance between continents shrank. The Cold War only amplified this trend, with each superpower competing not just for aerial supremacy but also for prestige in the skies. By the mid-20th century, jets had moved from experimental prototypes into everyday reality. Their presence changed warfare, economies, and the very way humanity understood space and distance. The revolution was complete. The jet was no longer the future, it was the present. The last 2 decades have seen aviation undergo profound refinement. The roar of the jet remains, but its meaning has changed. Once symbols of raw power, jets are now marvels of efficiency, sustainability, and advanced engineering. One of the biggest transformations has been the rise of fuel-efficient airliners. Aircraft like the Boeing 787 Dreamliner and Airbus A350 use composite materials, quieter engines, and aerodynamic designs that cut fuel burn by nearly 20%. These jets are not only cheaper to operate, but also central to airlines' promises of greener travel. Long-haul routes that once demanded stopovers are now achievable non-stop, connecting distant cities with unprecedented ease. The jet has become both an economic engine and a tool of globalization. At the same time, military aviation has diversified. Fifth-generation fighters like the US F-35 Lightning II, Russia's Su-57, and China's J-20 combine stealth, sensor fusion, and networked warfare, far beyond the raw speed contests of the early jet age. These aircraft no longer just fly faster, they dominate digitally, integrating satellite data, AI-assisted targeting, and precision weaponry. Meanwhile, drones and unmanned jets have entered the picture, hinting at a future where human pilots may no longer sit in the cockpit. Yet with progress comes controversy. The push for hypersonic weapons, vehicles that travel over Mach 5, has ignited a new arms race, raising questions of stability and escalation. Civilian aviation faces its own ethical dilemma. While modern jets are cleaner than ever, aviation still contributes nearly 2.5% of global CO2 emissions. Calls for electric and hydrogen-powered aircraft are growing louder, but these technologies remain in early development stages. Globally, the center of gravity in aviation has shifted. Once dominated by the US and Europe, new hubs have emerged. In Asia and the Middle East, airports like Dubai, Doha, and Singapore have become international crossroads, built around fleets of advanced jets from Airbus and Boeing. Airlines such as Emirates, Qatar Airways, and Singapore Airlines now set global standards in luxury and connectivity. Perhaps most striking is how normalized jet travel has become. What once seemed futuristic is now routine. Millions step onto jets daily without a second thought. Business deals, reunions, humanitarian missions, even cultural exchanges all hinge on the availability of fast, reliable flight. The jet has gone from a marvel of technology to an invisible backbone of the modern world. And yet, the sound of a jet taking off still carries with it echoes of history. The ambition of WWII engineers, the Cold War competitions, the golden age of airliners. Today's jets are quieter, smarter, and more connected than ever, but they remain part of the same lineage that began with the roar of the Merlin and the scream of the first jet engines. The jet engine didn't just transform aviation, it transformed the world. Before its arrival, long-distance travel was slow, uncertain, and exclusive. With jets, the planet shrank. Journeys that once took weeks by sea or days by propeller-driven. Aircraft became measured in hours. Suddenly, the idea of a globalized world was not theoretical, it was lived reality. Culturally, the jet age redefined human perception of distance. The term jet set entered popular vocabulary in the 1950s and 60s, describing a new class of people who could live, work, and socialize across continents. What once seemed like privilege for the few soon became accessible to millions. Today, tourism, international business, even global education systems all depend on the jet. Militarily, the legacy is equally profound. The jet not only changed how wars were fought, but also how peace was negotiated. Supersonic interceptors, strategic bombers, and reconnaissance jets reshaped the Cold War balance of power, forcing diplomacy to adapt to a world where strikes could be delivered across oceans in minutes. The mere existence of jet-powered arsenals changed the calculus of global security. Technologically, the jet engine set off a chain reaction. The innovations in materials, science, aerodynamics, and propulsion cascaded into other industries: space exploration, power generation, even automotive engineering. Without the jet, there is no Apollo program, no reusable rockets, no hypersonic research pushing the limits of physics today. Perhaps its greatest legacy, however, is psychological. The jet gave humanity a new relationship with speed, space, and possibility. It taught us to think of the Earth as a single, interconnected system. The phrase "half a world away" lost its sting because, with jets, it was no longer unreachable. The engine became a symbol of both human ambition and human consequence, enabling connection but also forcing us to confront challenges like pollution, militarization, and resource use. In this way, the jet is more than a machine. It is a turning point in human history, a technology that permanently shifted how we live, fight, travel, and dream. From the battlefield to the family vacation, from the lab to the launch pad, the jet's influence continues to echo. The roar of the Merlin may have faded, and the first jet's scream may now seem primitive, but their legacy is everywhere. The jet age is not just a chapter of history, it is the foundation of our modern world. If World War II sparked the jet age, the question today is, what comes next? For over 7 decades, the jet engine has defined speed, distance, and power. But aviation is now standing at another threshold, one shaped by sustainability, new propulsion systems, and the push for even greater speed. One frontier is hypersonic travel. Engineers are testing aircraft capable of Mach 5 and beyond, where flight times between continents could shrink to just a few hours. Military programs in the United States, China, and Russia are racing to master hypersonic propulsion, but commercial aerospace firms are also exploring whether these advances could lead to the next Concorde moment for civilians. At the same time, green aviation is rapidly emerging. Jet engines consume vast amounts of fossil fuel, and as the world confronts climate change, sustainable alternatives are no longer optional. Biofuels, hydrogen propulsion, and hybrid electric systems are being tested with serious investment. Airbus, Rolls-Royce, and startups alike are betting that the next revolution in flight will balance speed with sustainability. Another transformative trend is autonomy. The integration of AI and advanced avionics hints at a future where commercial and military jets may require fewer human pilots, or in some cases, none at all. Unmanned aerial systems have already proven their utility, and the question now is whether large passenger jets could one day fly safely without a cockpit crew. Space also beckons. Companies like SpaceX are exploring point-to-point suborbital transport, where rockets could carry passengers halfway across the world in under an hour. If realized, such technology would blur the line between air travel and spaceflight, extending the jet's legacy into an entirely new domain. Of course, the future carries uncertainty. Will hypersonics be safe and affordable? Can hydrogen and electric propulsion truly scale to global demand? Will passengers accept AI as their pilot? These are not merely technical questions. They touch culture, politics, and human trust. What is clear is that the age of the jet was not the final destination, but a launch pad. Just as the Merlin gave way to the Whittle turbojet, the engines of today may soon feel like relics, stepping stones toward a faster, greener, and perhaps even spacefaring tomorrow. From the roar of piston-driven Merlins to the scream of turbojets, the Second World War marked more than just a conflict. It was the ignition point of modern flight. What began as a desperate race for survival reshaped the skies, opening the jet age and forever altering how humanity moves, fights, and dreams. We've traced the journey from fragile wooden prototypes to supersonic marvels, from military dominance to global connectivity, and now into a future where hypersonics, hydrogen, and AI may once again redefine the limits of the possible. Each step reminds us that aviation has never stood still. It has always pushed forward, faster, higher, and farther. That legacy is still unfolding. The question is not whether flight will change again, but how soon. If you enjoyed this exploration of aviation's transformation, don't forget to like this video, share it with others, and comment with your thoughts on the future of flight. And most importantly, subscribe for more stories that uncover the hidden turning points of history and innovation.